Please welcome Jeff Sussna.
Thanks, Sebastian. It's great to be back in Germany. As Sebastian mentioned, the first time we did a conference together, it was in Munich. And I'd never been to Germany before, so I thought I should do some research. So I went on the internet and looked up doing business in Germany, and I got all of these warnings about how Germans are very serious and sober, and you shouldn't make jokes, and you shouldn't be informal. And so I was kind of intimidated. And then I got here and I found out that everyone was very friendly, everyone was very helpful, and everyone was very funny. So anyway, I love coming here, and it's great to be back. As Sebastian said, I'm a consultant by trade. I specialize in IT transformation projects and helping companies really understand what it means to deliver continuous value. And my career spans 30 years now of building systems and leading organizations across the entire development, QA, and operations spectrum. So I have a somewhat unique perspective on DevOps, but I'm also very deeply inspired and influenced by design thinking in general and service design in particular. And as I look at new approaches to IT as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, it occurs to me at least that service design is really central to everything that we do. And what interests me is not so much how do we design nicer enterprise software user interfaces, or even how do we get designers and developers working together, so much as what happens when we apply design to IT itself, and beyond that, when we approach IT as a design activity. Because as software eats the world, and as every business becomes a digital business, we actually have to go beyond just trying to align IT with the business. What happens is that the boundaries between IT and the rest of the business start to dissolve. And this has the implication that we have to start to think about design and operations together, and designing and operating systems and organizations together. And to be honest, I think this is part of why people sometimes struggle with understanding DevOps, because, as Sebastian mentioned, it really spans technology and culture. It really spans and has to bring together systems and organizations. And so there's kind of a broader way of thinking things that we need to do. And in particular, it was Adrian Cockcroft, who was formerly Chief Cloud Architect at Netflix and is a luminary in the cloud, DevOps, microservices world, who made the comment that DevOps is a reorg. And when he said this, it was a reflection of something called Conway's Law. So how many people here are familiar with Conway's Law? Okay. How many of you think you could recite it verbatim from memory? And has anybody here actually read in its entirety the original article that spawned Conway's Law? All right. So what I want to do today is I want to walk through the logic behind that article and explore what it means for us, and then actually go beyond that and talk about some things that Conway talked about that most people don't know about or talk about. So Conway's Law comes from a 1968 article called How Do Committees Invent?, written by Melvin Conway, who at the time was a software engineer and manager, and he was trying to understand how do you design good systems and how do you design systems well. And for him, a system could be anything from a piece of software to a piece of legislation. And what he saw in common across all of them is that if you're trying to design something of a sufficient level of complexity, you can't represent it as a single atomic monolithic thing. You have to break it down in some fashion. Your website has a home page, it has a search engine, it has a recommendation feature, it has a shopping cart. And once you do that, you now have to think about design on 3 levels. First, what should each component do? What should it look like? Second, how do the components communicate with or relate to each other? And third, how does this system of components and relationships emerge back into a coherent whole? Because what we're trying to build is a website, not just a disembodied set of modules. And Conway then turned his attention to thinking about the process of designing these systems, and he made a parallel set of observations. Again, if you're trying to design something of a sufficient level of complexity, you can't do it with a single atomic, monolithic person or group. You have to break it down, again, in some fashion. You know, you figure out the search engine, I'll figure out the shopping cart. And again, once you do that, you now have to work on 3 levels. How do you design components that work well and look right? How do you communicate with other design teams? And how does this system of teams and communications emerge back into a coherent organization that's more or less building the same thing in more or less the same way? Now, it's easy to see that these two mirror each other, but what Conway did was he observed that one drives the other, that the shape of your organization drives the shape of your design. And I had an experience early in my career that perfectly illustrates this at work. There was a team of 4 guys, and they were building a large, sophisticated application. They were all very skilled and experienced, a little egotistical, and they had a bit of a rivalry among themselves. So what they did was they broke the application up into 4 big chunks and said, you go figure out your piece, and I don't want to know about it. And I'm going to figure out my piece, and I'm not going to tell you about it. Now, in those days, when you were building a large application, one thing you always had to do was figure out something called memory management. And typically what you do is you'd get together and you design a single common memory management module and then use it throughout your application. So in this case, who can guess how many memory management modules this application ended up having? Yes, exactly 4. Each team member wrote his own to do more or less the same thing in a completely different way, used it in his part of the application, and ignored all of the others. And among other things, that meant that if a new person joined the team, they had to learn 4 different solutions for the same problem and where and how to use each of those solutions. So Conway expressed this in his article in the sentence which has become known as Conway's Law. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. In other words, the way you work together defines what you make. Now, Conway's Law is expressed as a constraint, something you have no control over. But more and more software companies are figuring out how to leverage that constraint to their own advantage by doing what's become affectionately known as the Reverse Conway. And the principle is really simple. If you want to end up with a particular design, if you make your organization look that way, you're guaranteed to get it. And so companies are deciding that the most important thing for them is the ability to go fast, to be able to deliver change quickly, continuously, and safely. And the best way to do that is to break their large applications into little self-contained, loosely coupled pieces called microservices. But what they're also figuring out is in order to make that work, they have to do the same thing with their organizations. And this is what leads to the so-called 2-pizza team. The idea that you break your organization into small, self-contained teams, small enough to feed with 2 pizzas is the idea, that have everything they need to operate: product, design, development, QA, operations, and support. Now, the DevOps community has really taken hold of Conway's Law. You can't shake a stick at a DevOps conference anymore without hearing the name Conway. But it's actually not the whole article. In the last half page or so, Conway drops this nugget, which to me is actually more interesting and more provocative, and depending on what you make of it, potentially more disturbing. And he starts with this comment: given any system design, someone will find a better one to do the same job. In other words, there's no such thing as a perfect design. I can't count the number of times I've gone back and looked at something I did a year ago and thought, oh, that was a really dumb way to do that. If I knew then what I know now, I would have done this really differently. And furthermore, no matter how much you iterate, no matter how much user testing you do, you can't perfectly predict how people are going to use your designs until they actually do it for real. And then you find out you thought you were trying to solve problem X. It was really problem X plus Y, or maybe it was X minus Y. And beyond that, the very act of using a design changes the user, and thus changes the design problem. Social media has profoundly transformed who we are, and in the process, it's transformed our expectations of social media. If you look at the kinds of problems that companies like Facebook and Twitter are dealing with today, they're different than the problems they faced when they were new. And there's no way they could have foreseen those problems because they didn't exist yet. So you could say that as important as the ability to design is the ability to redesign. But wait a minute. Don't we have a problem here? Doesn't Conway's law tell us that on some level we are doomed to forever stamp out the same designs over and over again? And this is why Conway made the statement at the very end of his article that I've taken to calling Conway's Corollary. And to me, it's worthy of deep and careful contemplation. Flexibility of organization is important to effective design. Okay, let's say we buy into that. How are we supposed to do it without falling into some kind of constant reorg madness? The same company where I worked that had the 4 guys who built the 4 memory managers also had this habit of every year and a half or so going through a company-wide reorg where they would switch from being a product organization to a project organization to a matrix organization and back again. So every couple of years, literally, they would make this big announcement. We need to be product-centric because of blah. We need to be project-centric because of blah. And the amount of time, money, energy, and waste that was involved was monumental. Well, to some degree, microservices and microservice organizations can point us in the right direction to resolving this dilemma. Because what they're really about is shifting us away from this industrial age machine metaphor model of design where we try and figure out what all the pieces are and how they all fit together, and then we try and lock it down really tightly so that everything will run very efficiently and smoothly. And towards a more complex systems approach where many small, simple components can interact with each other very dynamically and fluidly. And as a result, gain a level of flexibility and elasticity and resilience. But if all we do is shatter our systems and shatter our organizations into lots of little self-contained pieces, we risk replacing a few large silos with 1,000 little ones. We still have to figure out how the pieces emerge back into a coherent whole that lets us run our business. Fortunately, the answer is right in front of us. And it's right in the words that we're already using. And in particular, the word service. You know, we have left the product economy and we have fully entered the service economy. You can't even buy a font anymore and download it to your website. Instead, you license it, and the font vendor actually serves it up on your behalf from their IT systems. So font companies have gone from being product companies to being service companies. And the thing about service is it's different. And it's different in ways that may be more profound than we realize. Service value isn't something that you pour into an object and hand to your customer in exchange for money. The fact that you operate an airport and you have runways and airplanes and security gates and coffee shops doesn't do anyone any good until someone shows up and actually tries to fly to a different city. And when they do, they bring their particular needs and moods and experiences with them, and they intersect with your service systems and with your employees' needs and moods and experiences. And value arises in that intersection. And this has the effect of taking the sausage factory of operations, which traditionally has been hidden behind the scenes, in the back office, if you will, and bringing it forward and making it an explicit part of the value equation. I'm sure we've all had the experience of calling a customer support line and getting bounced from one agent to the next and one department to the next and constantly having to re-enter our personal information. And what happens is that the service providers' workflows and IT systems, and to some degree even their org chart and their history of corporate acquisitions, all surfaces and begins to directly impact the quality of the customer experience. So how do we design for service? How do we operate for service? Well, we have to start to turn our attention upward and outward, away from ourselves and what we're making, and towards our customers and their larger needs and goals. In some form of poetic irony, one of the best definitions of service I've ever encountered comes from ITIL, of all places. Now, ITIL talks a lot about service management and service design and service operations, and they start by trying to define what service means, and they do it with this wonderful idea, which is facilitating desirable outcomes. What's important is not building and operating a CRM system. What's important is what salespeople can accomplish because you've built and operate the CRM system. And something that's really important for us to understand in this room is that service is fractal. It's service all the way down. Your company is a service provider. Your IT and HR departments are service providers. Your design and development and QA and operations teams are service providers. Your microservices and microservice teams are service providers. At every level of the organization now, it's no longer about just doing what you do. Now, your job is about helping other parts of the organization to accomplish something larger, and by extension, to help your customers accomplish something larger. If we dig into this idea of services a little bit and ask ourselves, well, what really is a service? You could say it's a set of promises. Amazon promises to help you get everything you need in your life, from shaving cream to snow tires to books, as quickly and cheaply and easily as possible. And as part of that, they make other promises. If you have an important business meeting this week and you're out of shaving cream and you give them an extra $5, your shaving cream will show up. They promise it will show up on Tuesday instead of Thursday. They promise that even though they try to automate their relationship with you as much as possible, if you call customer support and you need help, the person who answers the phone will be knowledgeable and helpful and will stay on the phone with you until your problem is truly solved. And in order to keep that promise, they make other internal ones. They promise to evaluate their employees by metrics like first-time resolution instead of things like average call time. Now, we could define a promise as a voluntary commitment to provide benefit. And this is really important because it's something that we sign up for. It comes from the inside out and the bottom up, in contrast to requirements raining down from on high. And so promises can serve as the attractive force that pulls the pieces of your systems and the pieces of your organization back together into a coherent whole without making it rigid or brittle. Now, you may wonder a bit about this word promise. Why that word? Where is it coming from? On the one hand, it's very intuitive. We all know what a promise is. We all make promises to each other every day. Sebastian this morning promised to run a really great conference with really great food. And I can say, if nothing else, his conferences always have really great food. It's part of what I like about coming here. But in any case, it still may seem a little odd. Why aren't we using the word contract or guarantee? Well, the thing about promises is they represent commitments that may or may not be honored. Sometimes we break our promises. And this is actually a really good thing because it forces us to account for the possibility of failure, and as a result, increases our chances of success. I had an experience not long ago where I was trying to get paid by a large European client, and they needed to do an international wire transfer to my bank in the United States. And my bank wasn't really set up properly for it, so they had to do things in a very particular way, and it wasn't working. And this went around several times, and I started to get frustrated because I wasn't getting paid. And my client within this company also started getting frustrated to the point where he sent a scathing email to his internal AP team that he CC'd me on, saying, why can't you take the lead to figure out these problems so our vendor, who was kind enough to fly to Europe and help us, can get paid for his time? And the problem was the AP department was not equipped to think about, what do we do if things go wrong? So what promises do is they unify design and operations because they force us to continually ask ourselves, are we keeping our promises? Are we operating effectively? And if not, what needs to change? And on a more interesting level, are we making the right promises? Are we promising to make sure our vendor gets paid? Or are we just promising to enter some data into a system and report back the results, whatever they happen to be? And if not, what needs to change? Promises also unify the design of systems and organizations because we can use exactly the same language to talk about system promises for things like functionality, performance, availability, security, and promises between people and groups. In fact, you could look at DevOps as a new set of promises between development and operations. Instead of promising to deliver code every 3 months that works on my laptop, I promise to deliver code every 3 days or every 3 hours that works in a reasonable facsimile of production. And when you put these two together, the unity of design and operations and the unity of systems and organizations, you can achieve this organizational flexibility that was so important to Conway. And when you deeply understand the nature of service as a continual process of making and keeping and repairing promises, you begin to see design as continuous. Continuous in the sense that we do it continually over time. Continuous in the sense that we do it throughout the entire life cycle. We do it in production and operations as much as we do in earlier phases. Continuous in the sense that we see the design of systems and the design of ourselves as the organizations that make those systems as inseparable. And continuous in the sense that we do it at every level of the organization, from the very top to the very bottom. Now, when we talk about organizational design, we have a tendency to focus a lot on explicit organizational structures. But when we take this approach, it relaxes that as a constraint a bit. The problem with silos is not that things are separate. It's not that the designer and the developer and the sysadmin report to different managers. The problem is that they don't breathe. They don't have any way to connect to each other to create something larger. I have had the privilege in my career of working for some really excellent service agencies, both in IT and design. And I've worked with people who really deeply understood what it meant to truly empathize with their customers and to go beyond their assumptions of what they were supposed to be doing and understand what their customer really needed in a particular context. And as a result, they've been able to create greater value. They've been able to develop entire new lines of business. And they've been able to actually start to dissolve the boundaries between themselves and their customers. So when people ask me questions like, can you do DevOps across organizational silos? Can you do it with outsourced vendors? Can you do it with offshoring? To me, those are not the essential questions. What's more essential is to ask at every level of the organization, from the microservice and the microservice team up through the IT organization, all the way to the company as a whole, how do we start to shift our emphasis away from who am I, how am I structured, what do, what do I make, and towards how do I help? Because to serve really is the essence of service. So thank you very much, and as Sebastian mentioned, I've written a book. If you're interested in exploring these ideas of service and combining speed and coherency more deeply, I'd be honored if you'd read it, and I even have discount coupons if you're interested. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for this wonderful opening keynote. Maybe we got a little time. Maybe there is a question in the audience. Would you like to raise a question or to discuss what he has been telling us? Anybody? There's time. Knowledge exchange.
Maybe too early in the morning?
I got a question. Because if you're talking about this fascinating notion of service and this continuous and ongoing process inside of organizations, thinking about design and redesigning, etc., etc. If one likes that kind of idea, but on the other hand, the reality is totally opposite. Yeah, maybe you can give us maybe an example of what can be the first steps. What can be, because there's no golden recipe, of course, but some tiny steps, the tiny things one can do.
So that's a great question, and I actually get that question a lot. And speaking of organizations, what I would say is the first thing not to do is try and change your org chart. You don't need to start there, and the org chart really is a trailing indicator, not a leading indicator. The first thing I tell people to do is something really, really simple. It's talk to each other. If you have a problem, particularly a problem that's kind of bouncing back and forth between parts of the organization, get everybody together and just say, okay, for the next week, you're a team, and you're going to solve this, and you're going to solve it together. And it doesn't matter whether the answer is changing application code or application design or changing infrastructure or whatever the case may be. And that may seem very simplistic, but it's surprising how hard it is for people to talk to each other and listen to each other. And, you know, we're trying to do this DevOps thing, which basically means we have a bigger unit. Right? It's not just dev, and it's not just dev, it's dev and ops. And it's really hard. And people, you know, in terms of culture, people have to learn how to act differently with each other. So the first thing I would say is just start doing it. Take a simple project or a simple problem and a short period of time and just get people to start talking.
Is there anybody in the audience who tried something like that out? An experience?
These teams, are they meant to be fixed and closed, or should they change for every project?
That's another good question, and I've seen people do it differently. Yammer, a while back, had this process where after every small project, they would dissolve the team. And the reason for that was they wanted to sort of disseminate the knowledge and disseminate the working style. So they had these very, very transient groups. On the other hand, you know, if you talk to people like Adrian Cockcroft, who was at Netflix, there's this idea that your microservice is your product, and it's almost like you're a separate mini company and you own it forever. So on the one hand, I don't have a fixed answer. I won't say do it this way or do it that way. I think that given where most of us are coming from with this fractured, siloed knowledge, I would say that the most important thing and the place where most people will get the greatest benefit in the short run is to get people into teams that are fairly long-lasting, and they start to learn how to actually work with each other and be accountable to each other. And you know, we have this traditional approach to IT. I was talking to a client about this just the other day, where there's this notion that you make a proposal and you get funding and you build something and you deploy it and then you're done. And then the idea is that thing is going to sit there and it's going to run for 10 years and you don't have to worry about it anymore. We don't live in that world anymore. You know, part of where DevOps is coming from is that we don't have the luxury of making things that won't change for 10 years. And so we find ourselves more and more in the world of perpetual development and thinking about products and as opposed to projects. I have a friend who is a master's level professor, and he actually teaches an IT curriculum, and he's starting to have conversations. One of the requirements for graduation in this program, and a lot of IT master's program, is project management. And he's starting to ask the question, should we get rid of that as a requirement and have product management instead, because we really need to think about these products that live for a long time. Yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
It looks like that in the teams designed the new way, everybody is in charge of thinking and deciding every time. What happens to procedures? You know, I'm Italian. I'm not a big fan of procedures, but what is the...
So you came to Germany to learn about how to have good procedures?
Yeah. No, I came to Germany to learn how to let machines do procedures. So what is the blurring line between machines running procedures and human thinking about everything and deciding every time?
Well, if you think about things like continuous integration and continuous delivery and infrastructure as code, it's all about procedures. And it's all about automating those procedures. And, you know, if you have a CI culture where you say, if you break the build, you fix it, and we stop deploying until you fix the build, that's a procedure. So I think that in DevOps, you know, it's just like Agile. People thought, oh, Agile is a bunch of hippie commies who don't want to follow any rules. And that actually wasn't the case. And it's the same with DevOps, is there are lots of rules. They're intended to be a different kind of rule that, you know, basically the rule says you now have the ability to make creative decisions much more continuously and much more often in much smaller units.
So do you think that procedures are replaced by principles?
No. I think they're augmented by principles. I don't think they're replaced. And again, to some degree, the procedures go into the machine, but it's not the Jenkins as a machine is going to tell you that your tests failed. It's not going to force you. I mean, I see plenty of companies where they will happily live with a broken build for days or weeks at a time. There's no machine that's going to force them to fix the build. So that's the kind of decision making that you have to do, which is we understand why it's important to fix the build. We understand why our lives will be better if we stop and fix it now rather than waiting to the end. But no machine is going to force you to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments and your questions. Thank you very much for your answers. And please give a hand to Jeff Sussna for his wonderful opening keynote. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.